That's a bad start.
Good morning. I think we're all set to begin to a very exciting session. My name is Mauricio Cárdenas, and I'll be your moderator. This is a special session because I think it touches on an issue that is really relevant. We have a lot of ambition, we have aspirations, we have goals, but achieving them is a different story. So I think the title of Decarbonization and Insurmountable Challenges is very well placed. To reach net zero by the mid of this century, 50% of the carbon emission reductions that need to take place need technologies that are not developed yet, or if existing, they're not scalable. So that means we're far away. I was looking at some data from the IEA on the amount of investment on clean energy relative to fossil fuels. It's $1.50 of renewable energy per dollar of fossil fuel investment. To get to the goals in 2030, we need to be investing $9 in renewable energy per dollar in fossil fuels. So we're still far away from there. So this is a little bit of a chicken and egg issue, whether it's demand that will generate the technological transformations or whether we need to incentivize supply. But the real issue here is that we need to create markets. And creating markets is very difficult. It doesn't really happen by coincidence and by chance. How are these technologies created? How is the supply of these technologies advanced? And this is what we are going to be discussing today in this session. We're going to look at some of the experiences. We're going to look at what has happened, the challenges ahead. If you think about supply, one of the restrictions is access to financing. Creating these technologies, creating these goods and services requires resources. There are many risks involved, and that's a barrier. And on the other hand, if you're on the buying side, sometimes the prices of these net zero consistent goods and services are high. The green premiums are significant, and that is a barrier too. So how to overcome these obstacles is a crucial question. Come to emerging markets, and all these problems get even bigger because of the political risks, the legal risks, the macroeconomic risks, the size of the markets. So how are emerging markets going to do this transition and achieve the emission reductions that they have committed to? There are a number of initiatives in the world that try to deal with these questions. And the members of this panel are very important players and very important actors in many of these initiatives. And we'll talk a bit about them. And we're going to explore what has happened, what's the role of financing, what's the role of public policy, what's the role of multilateral development banks. And I want to put a special emphasis on one particular area, which is nature-based solutions, which is also very important, and where the inexistence of markets is even greater. So that's another important aspect. So the members of this panel are going to share their experiences. They're going to talk about the innovative partnerships in which they have been participating, some pilots that could be successful and could be replicated, the role of policies, the role of financing, public-private partnerships, etc. So I'm going to introduce them as they speak. To my left, Vice President Al Gore needs no introduction. Vice President Gore, as you all know, now is the chairman and co-founder of Generational Investment Management, an asset manager. I can ask you about your role as an investor. Are you seeing progress in terms of the technologies that are necessary to get to net zero? Your role as a policymaker. The United States recently enacted the Inflation Reduction Act, which many see as a source of, as a boost to the development of these technologies. And recently, you've made some comments about the role of multilateral development banks. So it's a whole menu, maybe three questions in one. But I guess the audience would love to hear your thoughts about this.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. It's an honor to be a part of this distinguished panel, and an honor to be with you, Mauricio. We worked together for many years, and in 1999, when he was on the member of the cabinet in Colombia, I went as Vice President of the U.S. We launched Plan Colombia. You launched Plan Colombia, but I was honored to be present for it. You know, last week we heard the news from the World Meteorological Organization that the first crisis of the global atmosphere is now receding. In the mid-'80s, the shocking hole in the stratospheric ozone layer appeared above Antarctica. The scientists issued a dire warning, and indeed, it was a dire warning, and we now know it was even more serious than they knew at the time. But luckily, leaders responded. Margaret Thatcher took her degree in chemistry, understood it, persuaded Ronald Reagan to join. In the Montreal Protocol negotiations, there were not only government participants, but private participants. And the reason I'm telling you this story is that the chairman of the host committee in Montreal I was in the Senate at that time and sponsored the legislation to ratify the treaty and so forth. We had hearings on it. But the CEO of Northern Telecom was the host of the sponsoring committee in Montreal. He made a commitment. We're going to get rid of these chemicals that deplete the ozone layer. And there was a great applause. He used them for cleaning circuit boards. They were used for a number of things, spray cans and so forth. And the applause was not present the following Monday when he met with his engineers and his staff at Northern Telecom, because they told him, we have no idea how we're going to do this. And he said, well, I made the commitment, we're going to have to do it. And they worked and they pressed on all the edges of the problem. And finally, a question was asked that hadn't been asked before. We use these things for cleaning the circuit boards. How do the circuit boards get dirty in the first place? And that led to the so-called no-clean process, which revolutionized that aspect of the industry. They shared the intellectual property with all of their competitors, and they moved forward quickly. And here we are a few decades later, and the UN body is telling us it's worked. You know, we still have another 40 years before it closes up. Now we have the much larger second crisis of the global atmosphere. One thing that is illustrated by that story is if we truly make a commitment, then other things move with us. If we, you know, there was in the ancient world, the explorers would sometimes, the captain of the ship would burn the ship to say, you know, we're not going back, we're going forward. I'm not recommending we burn any ships and add to the CO2, but I think we have to make a commitment. And we can't be discouraged by some of the slow pace of this development. The late economist Rudy Dornbush has a law named after him. And Dornbush's law says things take longer to happen than you think they will. And then they happen much faster than you thought they could. And we've all seen that. We just saw it with the Chat GPT in the AI world. All of a sudden, wow. And there's so many other examples, computer chips and all the rest. And we are now seeing a whole collection of technologies that are moving toward that inflection point. We are in the midst, I believe, my partners and I believe very strongly, that the world is going through a sustainability revolution that has the scale of the Industrial Revolution coupled with the pace of the digital revolution. New levels of hyper efficiency, new information tools, AI among them, and machine learning, and the network of things, and blockchain, and in the biological world as well. Executive teams are finding a new ability to manage protons and electrons and atoms and molecules and genes and proteins with the same proficiency that the IT companies have demonstrated in managing bits. And we're seeing breakthrough after breakthrough. Now finally 3D printing is now, took longer than we thought, but now it's coming very, very quickly. Now, we have to finance this technological revolution. And the private sector has to join the public sector. But the public sector has to define policies that open up the private investment. In some ways, we're like a marathon runner with long pants like these with a bulldog on each pant leg trying to run. One is oil and one is gas. And they are, not all of them, but many of them, fighting tooth and nail in every forum, national, international, regional, even municipal. In my home city of Nashville, Tennessee, a new, more efficient, lower carbon transportation plan was defeated because a fossil fuel company came in and with disguised formulas financed the opposition to it far larger than the pro. And this is happening all over the world. Enough already, enough. And I don't want to get sidetracked onto what needs to happen, but we need to scale up climate finance, but we need desperately to scale down anti-climate finance. And we are still subsidizing the burning of fossil fuels globally at a rate 42 times larger than the subsidies for the shift toward renewables and EVs, et cetera. Now, I'm going to run out. I'm going to say one other thing. I know the last thing you asked me to cover was the MDBs. 88% of the projected increases in emissions come from the developing countries. They do not have practical access to private capital today. Globally, you can sketch a success story. Last year, if you look at all of the new electricity generation installed worldwide, 90% was renewable. Virtually all of that wind and solar. It's the cheapest by far. Where did the money come from? 86% of it came from private capital. But if you're in Nigeria, you have to pay interest rates 7 times larger than a European country or a North American country. It's absolutely insane. And here we are at Davos, where the public-private cooperation for improving the state of the world is front and center, and we celebrate democratic capitalism and the capitalist system. I'm a capitalist, but if we have a global allocation system for capital that deprives the vast majority of people who live in developing countries from any meaningful access, then we're kidding ourselves and we have no credibility. We have to reform the MDBs. We need new leadership at the World Bank. We need them to scale up the leverage and vastly increase the amounts that are committed. And we need to rein in the anti-climate activities of the fossil industries.
And this gives me the right leeway to get into Odile Renova.
I'm sorry, I pressed my own button.
Odile, as you know, is the president of the European Reconstruction and Development Bank, the EBRD, and this is the perfect connection with the work of the bank, because as you know, the bank has been very involved in the issue of renewables. They just announced in Egypt during COP27, cooperation with the Republic of Egypt on developing the renewable energy and decommissioning some fossil fuels. So I think the role of MDBs, especially in emerging economies, is very important. And what do you think needs to change? And what is the EBRD doing that could set an example to others?
So first of all, I think that we are working in countries, MDBs mainly, broadly, working in countries which are much far away from the technology you were talking about. So of course there is a lot of very positive development in technology, but we are talking about countries that are still very reliant on fossil fuel, have very high energy intensity, have a lot also of, vested interest in continue to rely on existing source of energy and so forth, and have difficulties to have access to finance because indeed, the risk is higher and appetite to invest in these countries is limited from the private sector, and the size of the market also is not so large. So I think it's very important for MDBs to consider this climate change, green transition as part of their mandate, at the core of their mandate. And for EBRD, for example, we, first of all, put for ourselves a target of having 50% of our investment in the green sector, so facilitating, so in renewable, any project of decarbonization, improving energy efficiency, energy saving, and so forth. So this is, and we are almost, the objective was to be there in 2025. We are almost there, 49.8% this year. And also to ensure that all our investment are Paris aligned. And this is something we start to do this year. So we are monitoring and reviewing all our investment to be sure that they are consistent with Paris Agreement. And to do that, there is a lot of work to be done. I think one of the key responsibility we have is to work with our countries and operation to define the right strategies. It's not only going project by project and finance one renewable project there and one decarbonization there, but it's helping them to define a strategy and the right policies in order to ensure that they will reach their objective. A lot of them have already defined objective, not all of them, but some of them have already committed to net zero in 2050. Right. But so have the right policies in place. And it's not only, so it's investment framework, it's long-term strategies, it's sectoral strategy, how to abate sector. It's a lot of work where you need to have consistency. And the interest of the project we had in Egypt, which was more than a project, it was an overall strategy, was really to talk to the Egyptian authority and tell them, well, you have a lot of gas resources. You need foreign exchange currency. They are deeply imbalanced in terms of foreign exchange. So you would bet, and you have a huge potential in renewable, and renewable is much cheaper. You have a lot of space. You can do a lot of renewable. You can become a huge energy power in the world, being able to export this energy to Europe, which is in dire need of energy. And so that you could really, you should decommission gas power plant and develop renewable. So the agreement we reached with them was to decommission 5 gigawatts of gas power plant, then give them possibility to export, to get foreign currency, and they will develop 10 gigawatts of renewable, even more, probably they are on the track to do more. And to do that, we needed to address, to bring together a lot of partners and to address specific issues, which is to ensure just transition. It's not easy to close, and for them it was not easy to decide to close a gas power plant, so they need to have subsidies, soft money really, to support training people, moving out of this power plant, and enhance the grid. Because, and then also it's not so easy to have commercial financing for grid development and so forth. So we brought together donors funding, big support from the US. John Kerry helped us a lot to bring all that together. Mm-hmm. Germany, France, a lot of countries participating to this grant financing, then some soft financial concessional lending from some MDBs, and then we hope the private sector will come in, and there is already a lot of interest to finance the renewable part. And I think this is a very good example of how you bringing this, having a sort of strategic approach and bringing together very concessional financing, MDB resource and private sector, we can scale up and really change the situation of one country in terms of energy.
Thanks, Odilo. I'm going to move to the extreme. Christian Momentaler is the group CEO of Swiss Re, and the insurance industry is so interlinked with this conversation in many dimensions. Many of these projects, to be viable, need to be de-risked. Someone has to take the risk. If you are an off-taker, if you are a buyer of a new technology, the risks associated with those technologies. Maybe you're going to be building homes with net zero cement, and who's going to insure those risks? Or you could also need to reduce the risks associated with the production itself. So the insurance companies are quite involved. But Christian is also the co-chair of the group of CEOs that are climate leaders. And that group has set very ambitious net zero targets for their own company. And to hear your experience in that front also will be very useful. And to add to this, the World Economic Forum and the Department of State of the United States recently launched First Movers Coalition, which is essentially about becoming the buyers, helping the demand side of this new technology. So as you can see, Christian has many, many hats, and it will be very interesting to hear your insights about this.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It's a great honor to be part of this panel. So maybe I start just with Swiss Re as a typical corporate and the challenges you have transitioning to net zero. So Swiss Re, of course, because that's our core business, we saw very early on that climate change was happening. We see it in the figures. So we were early in 2003. We pledged to get to carbon neutral. That was the term at the time. And we managed then to reduce scope 1 and 2 by 65% per employee. Because we started early and we buy 100% green energy and we worked on our buildings and we fly less and et cetera, et cetera. So you can do it. I think every company can do that. That's the easier part. But like many of the companies, our scope 1 and 2 is only 5% of our total footprint. So the vast majority is scope 3. Upstream and downstream. For us, it's downstream. So that's all of our investments. We have 100 billion of investments. So what we had to do there, we joined the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, and we now have measurements of the carbon footprint of every investment. And once you have that, you can actually reduce it at any pace because you divest, basically, which is not something we prefer because we want to influence the companies. We have hundreds of discussions with companies over the year on how to encourage them on their path to net zero. But the asset side, I think, is feasible. We switched all assets, 100 billion in 2017, to an ESG benchmark, which means that we stay in every industry, but we only invest in the 50% best, according to the benchmark, which is never perfect. But that gives an incentive. So basically, you can be in every industry and be supported by us, and we will have a dialogue with the leaders and encourage the leaders. On the underwriting side, where we take risks from other companies, which is our core business, there's no measurement. SBTi hasn't come up with something. How do you measure the footprint of a reinsurance contract? So we had to create another alliance in the insurance industry to try to come up amongst ourselves with some measurements, as long as SBTi hasn't come up with a measurement. And we announced here, after 2 years of work, it's really difficult at Davos this year, that we have now measurements. And as soon as we have measurements, things get done. So I'm quite optimistic for the insurance industry, because there's about 20 companies participating, that they will start to have signals on the insurance and reinsurance side in the industry. But you see some of the struggles. Some of the definitions are not here. Some of the influence is not here, etc. So, and if I move now up to this WEF Alliance, we have 127 CEOs. It's the toughest criteria to be in. So you need to be net zero 2050, you need to report, and you need to be SBTi compatible where SBTi has traced the path. So these are very seriously committed CEOs. And the scope 1, 2, and 3 footprint of them together will be the 3rd largest country in the world. So these are large companies. Now, we measured their progress. We made amongst ourselves, we checked between 19 and 20. So scope 1 and 2, we had a reduction of 22%. So it's really good. You can say really good. We make good progress in our own companies. But when it comes to scope 2 already, it's more patchy. Some of it is there's no green energy in some countries where they are, so we need to create supply. And scope 3, this is where the work hasn't even started. It started about 12 months ago. And scope 3 is really where we have a huge leverage. Because these 127 companies probably have 100,000 suppliers. And they need to send the price signal out to these 100,000 suppliers that they have to be net zero, otherwise we can't be net zero. And that's the tipping point. I'm seeing the tipping point. That makes me modestly encouraged about the path we're taking, because it's very different dynamics now. There's going to be massive price signals going out, signals from big corporations that if you want to be in the value chain, you need to act. Now, one of the challenges in the value chain, we did some calculations, actually the most end products only become 1 to 4% more expensive if you produce it green original materials, so green aluminum, green steel, green cement. They're very expensive, but they're small part of the end product. So a house, a car, an iPhone only gets 1 to 4% more expensive. So it's feasible, but it's not happening because the companies who produce that, who would have to switch to green steel, for example, they have very thin margins, and they think that if they switch to that, they will never be able to sell it. So you need to work across the value chain. So the richer companies, and of course, for example, Apple is a good example, they have committed to buy the first green aluminum. It's a powerful idea, because that helps people to produce the first green aluminum. They go through the efficiency curve, then it gets cheaper, then more companies come in, etc. So this is a super important mechanism which has been taken up by John Kerry also, Bill Gates. I mean, several people had similar ideas. And that's something we do in the coalition, work across the value chain and try to help each other. So it's real. I mean, the movement is real. Al Gore knows that 15 years ago we were here. There's like 5 interested CEOs. It's on the fringe. Nothing is happening. Now, even the CEO don't totally believe or don't understand the science. It doesn't matter. They realize everything is changing. And if they're not part of this process, it's actually a strategic issue, a very big strategic issue. If you don't invest now and can provide green shipping, for example, in 5 years, and suddenly everybody switches, you have a change in attitude, you're left behind. So that's powerful. These are all nonlinear effects that encourage me.
Fantastic. Well, this idea of the first mover is so clever and so important, especially if you believe in economies of scale. Costs are going to go down.
Yes.
And the role of the first movers is essential, because it will trigger the change that will take place in the technology, in steel, in cement, in shipping, in trucking, aviation. We haven't talked about the importance of sustainable fuels for aviation and the changes that can have in terms of on climate. I'm going to bring into conversation an asset manager. Ronald Weister is the CEO of APG. APG is a pension asset manager in the Netherlands. And you have also been very, very active in the community of asset managers that is behaving responsibly in terms of having net zero goals. And I'm particularly interested in your role as an equity investor. What needs to take place for expanding equity investments in these technologies that need to be developed, especially to avoid the valley of death. There is money for research and development. Innovation can take place, but then there is no resources, there is no funding for the deployment of the technologies, for creating a market. Once the market is created, there's the resources. Everyone wants to invest in these corporations. How to avoid that phase, which is critical. That's when many new ideas disappear because they don't have the funding and the resources.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question. I will start addressing your question as what can you do as an equity manager, and also talk a bit about your earlier question in your introduction about the link with nature. I think we are an equity investor for roughly 60-65% of our portfolio, and we follow an asset class life cycle where we start investing in early stage venture capital, or even before that, startup companies, thematically based, and then try to follow through companies in the life cycles if and when possible, and when you're able to scale up certain investments, even reaching to the stage of listing public market and then holding on to the same company. Particularly in infrastructure, we try to provide equity to change things, and also in real estate and land investments. talking a bit about the link with nature. We try to combine these days net zero with nature positive, but also that in terms of life cycle, nature is a little bit more early where climate action is well established, but well established doesn't mean it's been solved. It's only solved to a very limited amount, but it's more established, and we are still searching for measurement standards, although we have an AI-based solutions for biodiversity, but we link it more and more with climate action, and I think there's a strong link. When I say climate action is well established, I mean that and I know measurement is not perfect, but we can measure things. Carbon footprint is something we can measure. It's easier to set targets, and we've set standards. We still compete too much, also amongst asset management, but definitely in the world there's too many competing standards, but at least there's standards out there. And there's solutions that we can invest in. In biodiversity, this morning I was in a panel about AgTech. I think it's very early stage, and in climate we have electrical cars, solar panels, and that's already very much later in the game. And there's many public market listed examples of things you can invest in. What do we do as an equity investor? Yes, standard setting, yes, measurements, and then we want to, of course, invest in solutions. And now we're at a time that this becomes more and more about also drawing consequences from the things that we've been asking for. You can engage. You are asking for changes in the companies we invest in. We do have a net zero commitment for 2050 for our investment portfolio as a company for 2030, but you can already see that certain companies are not achieving what you wanted them to achieve. And then it becomes interesting because we know what the action issue needs, we know what we've been asking for, but what happens if companies do not follow through, when they don't deliver? And on the one hand, you want to see successes, and there are certain easier successes than others. You talk about Apple and green aluminum. I think it's good to have successes as well, because that shows examples of things that we can do, and it's important to be able to change things and see those successes in your portfolio. But then talking about fossil fuels, that is hard to see the change, and there one of our largest client, the government pension fund, now decided to divest from fossil fuels because they thought the effectiveness of our engagement was not good enough. One could debate, should you stay on to an investment and continue to ask for the change? And when do you say, here's the line, here we draw the consequence, here we're going to act and divest? And at the same time, you know you're losing influence if you divest. So that's why I also emphasize that it's important to have those successes in your portfolio. But if there's no stick, if there's no threat of divestment, then I think it's also not working. So that's why the divestment tool is important. We realize that if we step out on behalf of our clients, others may step in. We may not starve out companies already. There will not be a lack of capital yet. Mr. Kort talked about subsidy for the other side, but I think you need to also be aware of the consequences that you should take, and that's what we try to do. Of course, equity is the most effective way of influencing, but also in fixed income financing, you can, of course, have a certain amount of influence. So also in the fixed income portfolio, across asset classes, if you have a combination of debt and equity investments, you can be influential.
Well, you both, Christian and you, are asset managers. I mean, insurance companies are asset managers. Are you imposing on the investments criteria, the net zero criteria, ensure that the issuers of equity or the fixed return investments are compliant? And this is a criteria that is now being observed regularly, and that we can feel that in this, at least in this sense, the glass is half full.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, we measure the carbon footprint, so maybe some are not yet committed to net zero, but they will fall out on the path to 2050. So we have a clear communication to everybody, and what gets measured gets done. So I'm on the asset, I'm not so worried. I'm more worried about private capital coming in, maybe other countries and others. That's something he expressed, which is also our fear. So to a certain extent, it would be better if you owned some of these companies and steered in the right direction rather than threatening to divest or divesting, which we do, but the consequences are not that dire for the companies.
I want to go back to government and the role of public policies. We mentioned at the beginning the Inflation Reduction Act. It has been received here in Europe with some degree of controversy, especially because of the subsidies to American-produced electric vehicles and their components. But the strategy that the EU is pursuing, which is essentially heavy in subsidies, is essentially tax breaks for a long period of time, requiring the manufacturing of some key components in the United States. Do you think it's going to trigger this the generation of kind of like new technologies and new ideas and new investments and new opportunities, and maybe set an example for other countries? We're entering here the world of industrial policies. For many years we couldn't talk about industrial policies, but now they're back in vogue. But I want to hear your thoughts, especially on these more controversial aspects of whether there's some protectionism there.
Yeah, first of all, let me say I chair an asset management firm, have for 18 years. We, Generation Investment Management, hosted the very first meeting. There were only 5 of us of the Net Zero Asset Managers Alliance, and we've worked very hard on that. We're committed to a net zero portfolio by 2030. In any case, on the Inflation Reduction Act, I saw Senator Joe Manchin this morning. We had a visit on this, and of course there has been some criticism from Europe and from some other regions about what some perceive as a flavor of protectionism in some of the provisions. The way it's going to be implemented will be in a way that takes these concerns into account. The Biden administration has already pledged if there are some changes that we can make, fine. But I come from a tradition in politics that traces back to Cordell Hull, who was Secretary of State for longer than anyone in American history and was the father of the reciprocal free trade movement. And he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1945, father of the United Nations, father of the GATT, which became the WTO. I believe in reciprocal free trade very strongly. But we are seeing around the world, in the response to this climate emergency, a necessity of marshaling political support for unprecedented measures. We want to avoid protectionism, of course, and I have encouraged the EU to match what the U.S. has done. And we've now seen the movement towards CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which formerly the U.S. has opposed. I'm all for it. I think it's a great idea. And like the Inflation Reduction Act, if it's implemented properly, it can lead to a race to the top, where countries try to outdo one another in moving faster to carbon-free, net zero technologies. I think it's likely to have that outcome. And your final part of your question was, is it going to unleash investment? Yes, it's already doing so. The number of contracts that have been signed just since the passage of this legislation last fall has been astonishing, last August. It really is incredible. And let me point out something else. You mentioned that the bulk of the muscle in this Inflation Reduction Act is in the form of tax credits. And they've been costed out at $369 billion. But they're open-ended. I believe, based on the results of the last 6 months, we're going to see a commitment of U.S. resources far larger than $369 billion. And these tax credits are not time-limited either. And they can't be overturned by, if a Republican president's elected, as long as you don't have a supermajority in the U.S. Senate, they're not going to be changed.
This idea that they're open-ended is so important. I was finance minister, and I tell you this, based in my experience, tax credits work if you provide them for a long period of time. You just say it's going to be there for 1-2 years. They don't actually do the trick. I saw your hand, Chris.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that because there's a different perspective. Well, actually, my perspective is exactly the same. So we have a lot of European CEOs in our alliance. And so in our meetings, we talk about that. And several of the most knowledgeable ones in that area have said the Inflation Reduction Act from the US is a real game changer in a positive sense, like a real game changer. It's going to create some new markets. And there's a certain frustration, of course, amongst these CEOs. And this morning we had a meeting, and what you hear is, okay, America incentivizes, Europe regulates. So Europe is more the mindset of don't do this, don't do that, don't, etc. So I think it's a challenge to Europe, and our hope is that we will match it. Yes. This I think the only way. So we're not negative about it. We just say we need to get our act.
And there will be competition, which is good. Competition between regions, governments, etc., in terms of who's going to provide the greater stimulus for and subsidies for these technologies to be developed. But I want to come back to financing, Odile, especially because you hear so often the word de-risking, that you need to de-risk these projects. And these projects are full of risk, and there are risks for off-takers, risks for the innovators that create these new technologies. I'd say the right word is like allocating the risk, because the risk is there. Should banks, and especially development banks, it could be national, regional, multinational, take more risks so that these technologies are developed? And you also hear so much the idea that development banks have to be catalyzers that bring in more private investment. Is the way multilateral development banks, regional development banks are structured, is it really going in that direction? Is that going to happen?
I really believe that's what we are doing, because when we invest in a project, first of all, we help preparing the project, ensuring that it's well structured, that you have the appropriate regulatory framework. As I was saying, we work a lot on, for example, we worked in the EBRD a lot on developing in countries auctioning for renewable energy, so that you have a sort of transparent, open framework where developers come and go to develop renewable, be it in wind or solar. So that's a very sound framework in order to attract private sector developers, and there are a lot of companies now, international companies, investing in these countries. The fact that we invest together with them is also a way to de-risk, because first of all, we put our money where our mouth is, and we have been engaged with the government, and we can also work with the government in case there are some troubles. And in some countries, we've seen in renewable a lot of difficulties in tariff, too high, too low. So that the intervention of MDBs help to secure the environment. And so this is, I think, our key role also in the development of new technology, because, for example, now renewable is well established, very cheap, very commercially sound, I would say. But of course, if you want to develop green hydrogen, which is, it's much more, the cost is higher, it's not still completely cost efficient, and for the country which are the first mover, you have more risk, because then you have the higher cost, and when others come later on, they are better, it's cheaper. So, that's something we need to help to mitigate. So that's what we are doing. I think there is a bit of a mismatch between sometimes the expectation when G funds talked about, hundreds of billions of asset managers, trillions, hundreds of trillions, asset managers, investors willing to invest in the green transition, but not willing to invest in developing countries. That's, we cannot guarantee hundreds of trillions with our balance sheet. So I think that there is a bit of a mismatch between expectation created and what is really we can do. But I think our role is really to de-risk. And as of now, I would say, you were asking the question of capital. I think as of now, because in EBRD, I think that we do not see so much project. There is no project we cannot finance because we are limited in capital. But if there will be an acceleration of the transition in emerging countries and developing countries, and then we will need to step up, I think.
If I could comment briefly, if all of the MDBs operated as EBRD, then we'd be in very good shape. But the larger MDBs are in desperate need of reform. Of course, in 1944, the Bretton Woods Conference established the mechanisms that we are still living with today. They are no longer fit for a purpose. And you talk about de-risking, off-take risk, and so forth. The main risk in the developing regions, or one of them, is political risk, rule of law risk, corruption risk. And some of these things are difficult to talk about. But it's not fair to ask APG or Swiss Re or Generation Investment Management to take those risks when the clients whose assets are being managed are going to be extremely unhappy. It's not sustainable. So the purpose of the World Bank, and in different ways the IMF and the other larger MDBs, is to take those top layers of risk off the top to level the playing field so that countries like Nigeria, that I mentioned earlier, don't have to pay a 7x interest rate, but can compete effectively. And one of the World Bank put out a new blueprint. It's very disappointing to me. There are a few things that are good in it, but we need major change. And they need to change their leveraging ratios, which is not a reckless act. It can be done. This has been sketched out very, very thoroughly. And we need new leadership. It's not personal to the person who's a long history of being a climate denier. It's absurd to have a climate denier in charge of the World Bank when the world is trying to solve the climate crisis. It's crazy. But it's not him personally. It's the fact that new leadership coupled with massive reform can open up massive flows of private capital to developing countries.
Very good. Well, on that note, and I'll add to it that it's about leadership, but it's also about capital. And capital for these entities puts us in the radar screen of the US Congress, which is always a difficult issue. But capital to be able to leverage more resources for institutions like the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank or the institutions that require the capital, because otherwise the amounts that are necessary to really finance the transition are not there. So we need to also work on the political side in Washington. Well, thank you. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you all of you for being here. And thank you to the panelists.
Gracias.
Oh, it's nice seeing you too. Hi.
How are you?
Hi, good to see you.
Well done to represent the asset manager. We met already, you know. I'm the chairman of FMA with Peter.
Oh, yeah.